Welcome back to Debunking Missionaries Part 2. So in this particular video, I'm going to be dealing with some continuation from the first video. The first couple of items that I'm going to be talking about this video in order to progress to the other videos is going to deal with what you see here, dealing with the issue of how missionaries, for example, consider statements in the New Testament to be more authoritative than the words of the Creator Himself, which are found in the Hebrew text of the Torah and the Tanakh, as well as dealing with the New Testament version of timeline, or time that I listed earlier, as well as contradictions in some of the writings of various people like Paul, as well as modern attempts by various messianics in modern times to try to present themselves as being Torah-based. Now, as I noted in the previous video, basically trying to theologically debate a missionary is a no-no because of the fact that if you can't deal with the historical facts first, there's nothing that you can agree upon in terms of what's so-called theology. Let me give you a prime example of this. First and foremost, there's a major conflict of interest when it comes to debating anyone from a missionary standpoint. And the reason is because of the two scenarios that don't match up. And the first one is that the people of Israel, Jewish people, and also Samaritans and Karaites, all agree that at a place called Har Sinai or Mount Sinai, their ancestors received the Torah from the Creator Himself. That the Creator Himself is the one who spoke the words, and eventually the people said that Moshe Rabbeinu would be the one that they wanted to go and represent them to speak to the Creator. But they initially, everybody heard the words of the Creator. Now here again, it's important to note that there are basically three groups who claim to be descendants of the people who heard the Creator speak at Mount Sinai, and that's basically Jews who keep Torath Moshe, Karaites, and Samaritans. There's no other group who claims to have been at this place and to have received the Torah. So that's the singularity of Torath Moshe, or Judaism. Now, the issue with Christianity and what the missionaries teach is that their singularity just simply comes from the writing of the New Testament. Because again, going back to the previous video, if you look at the actual text and the origin, many of the events are anonymous. And there's one interesting point made in the New Testament that basically missionaries hardly ever use in terms of defending their position. And that's dealing with what I brought up earlier about Acts 2:8. Now, in Acts 2:8, there's a story mentioned in the text that basically says that there was an event after, I guess, Jesus was supposedly gone, and some of his disciples were together in Jerusalem during the time of Shavuot, or people in English call it Pentecost, and that all of a sudden this event happened that all of these people who were there, including Jews from all over different parts of the world around this area of Jerusalem, around Israel, were there, and they witnessed this event taking place. But when you look at anything outside of Acts to try to say, okay, well, does anybody else mention this event? Does any other Jewish community from the areas that the New Testament in Acts 2:8 mentions, does any of those people have a history of that? You look around the Jewish world, you don't find anyone stating any such event ever took place. In fact, the book of Acts is the only mention of it, and missionaries don't use it at all. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because obviously the author of Acts was trying to make some parallel between the events that took place that he's mentioning and then to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai is the pinnacle point of the singularity of the Torah and of Torah Moshe and Judaism. So for a missionary to kind of like gloss over that and skip over that is very interesting. So this basically presents a situation where you can't equate the Torah to any of the Christian text or the missionary text. All of those texts, because they're come by the way of translation, because they come by the way of interpretive translation, of trying to fix the text so that it points to the concepts mentioned in the New Testament, they're not equivalent in any way. Further to this point, the texts that are used by most missionaries are not texts acceptable to Jews. So the two are not equivalent and they can't equate them. And a Jew would basically have to reject them on the grounds mentioned earlier. So this brings us to the historical points, something I mentioned in the previous video and something we presented in the previous video, and that's the timeline of basically what I would consider missionary slash Christian, I guess you could say, history. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is what I presented in the previous video, is the issue that the Jewish Christians, I mean, the actual people who are actually known and recognized supposedly as being Jewish, going by what the New Testament says, again, this is something that's questionable historically, they basically disappeared within 2 generations of their start. And this is interesting given the fact that when you look at like some of Paul's writings in a couple places mentions that the people who were believers at that time shouldn't get married as if the end was coming really close to the time that they lived in. Further to this point, the actual Jews who supposedly existed and believed in Jesus, they left none of their own text behind. None of the texts that are in the New Testament can be derived from any of the Jews who supposedly followed this movement. And there's only the mentions of their text in the writings of the various church fathers who come from the break, the next line down of when non-Jewish Christianity started up. They're the ones who talk about like some of these, I guess you could say, um, fringe groups that were out there that supposedly existed, like the Ebionites. But none of those people continued, and none of those people passed on any of their traditions or understandings to future generations. So looking at this timeline, this is the basic challenge that modern day messianics, such as Jews for Jesus, modern day the Nazarite movement, the Messianic Jews, or even some people who call themselves now Two Testament Judaism, this is the basic issue that they face, that they have no understanding of Torah or even the New Testament that can be directly connected to the first Jewish Christians at all. Every understanding they have, everything that they hold by or believe in, comes from the non-Jewish Christian movement that also had no connection directly to the first group of Jewish Christians. We know that the non-Jewish Christian movements that started after about the third century tried to distance themselves from anything that was Jewish and had no known Jewish members who transmitted through their ancestors or their descendants, I should say, any information of supposedly what those first Jewish Christians were really, really like in a way that you can say definitively they're talking about. So, in short, modern day messianic Jewish groups or Jews who believe in Jesus are unreliable in terms of sources of information about the New Testament and about the Torah itself, because most of them cannot claim a direct connection to any of those people or any of those events or any of that information. So basically, they have to be disregarded. So getting back to the point of how most missionaries treat the New Testament as if it's the words in the New Testament trump anything that the Creator Himself says, this can be seen in terms of how basically when it comes to trying to interpret information in the New Testament, if the Torah says one thing, and if the Creator clearly says some things about His nature and what He is and what He isn't, and the New Testament says something completely different, most missionaries go by what the New Testament says and basically try to redefine or reterm or even basically throw out how the Creator spoke Himself to the people of Israel. And this is a very important point because in the Torah, there are several places where the Creator Himself says that Israel was given the Torah in the way that it was, and He spoke to everyone in the way that He did, so that they would know for sure what the reality is, and that they would not be fooled by people coming back later and saying some things different. So in upcoming videos, I'll be covering this issue in more detail, and especially in part 3 and part 4, and that will be coming soon. And this brings us to the last issue of the person who is basically the author of most of the New Testament, even though he, according to the New Testament text itself, had never met Jesus at all. And this is Paul. The thing that about this, he's considered kind of a controversial individual within various sects of Christianity. But basically, the way I look at it, there's no proof that Paul was ever a Jew. There's no evidence that he, according to the New Testament, he claimed to have learned under Rabban Gamliel. There's no proof of that. If you look at Paul's ideas on marriage and things of how the Christians define sin, all of that contradicts the Torah. And further than that, there's a number of Christian groups who actually deny Paul as being a part of their group and believe that he was breaking Torah. So, given all this from a historical perspective, you can basically discredit all of the writings that are attributed to him or even about him. And that pretty much closes out this issue of the history section. Part 3 will be coming soon.